The dissolution of Sarah Ferguson's commercial interests represents more than a financial failure.
The revelation of the Epstein documentation in early 2024 precipitated a final reckoning with the reality of her position. Total isolation has followed, manifesting in the evaporation of the fiscal foundation required to sustain a royal existence. Relocating from the royal lodge to the peripheral quarters of an Austrian resort is not a mere move.
It is a structural collapse. The monarchy rarely evicts, it simply withdraws the invisible scaffolding of support. Historical precedents of 1992, the visual records of Street.
Terrifies were managed through a quiet alignment with the Duke of York's status. Today,
That sanctuary has vanished.
the Duke's own institutional marginalization has stripped away the Duchess's final layer of protection. A multi-million-dollar offer for a definitive autobiography now serves as a catalyst for professional self-destruction.
The paradox is absolute. Her only remaining capital is the betrayal of the institution she spent 40 years attempting to occupy.
To monetize these secrets is to trade an ancestral legacy for a momentary reprieve.
In the rigid architecture of the House of Windsor,
Silence is the only currency that retains its value over centuries. The act of selling a secret for survival ensures a permanent exile. The crown is a ledger that forgets nothing. History records the transaction. The institution simply closes the door. February 2026. The transition from institutional decline to systemic liquidation is complete. On the 19th of that month, the immunity inherent in the bloodline reached its expiration.
Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was detained.
The charge? Criminal breach of trust, involving the transmission of state trade secrets to private interests.
This was no longer a matter of social standing. It was a matter of national security. 2 weeks prior, the threshold of the Royal Lodge was crossed for the last time. The eviction removed the final physical barrier between the Yorks and the standard mechanisms of the common law. Without the shield of the estate, the fiscal reality of the Duchess's position became untenable.
The simultaneous collapse of her 8 media ventures was a predictable consequence of this institutional exile. In the Windsor hierarchy, commercial value is a derivative of the sovereign's favor. When the mantle of legitimacy is retracted, the market for proximity evaporates. A business model predicated on a crown that has severed the connection is a house built on sand. This dissolution highlights a fundamental truth of the monarchy. Power is never owned, only borrowed. Any branch that endangers the trunk is pruned with surgical precision. The events of 2026 were not a tragedy of circumstance, but a deliberate act of institutional preservation. The ledger is balanced. The York chapter is closed. The dismantling of the York household was a deliberate exercise in institutional sanitation. The unsealing of the United States Department of Justice archives functioned as a forensic audit of an indefensible alliance. Within these records lay a correspondence that defied the logic of dynastic survival. To characterize a convicted predator as a supreme friend and a pillar years after his initial sentencing is more than a failure of character. It is a total severance from the ethical mandate of the monarchy. The institution can absorb scandal, but it cannot tolerate the proximity of predatory exploitation. The gravity shifted from the personal to the dynastic with the revelation of a proposed meeting between Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie and the offender shortly after his 2009 release. This was no longer a matter of poor fiscal judgment. It was the active endangerment of the bloodline's symbolic purity. For the House of Windsor, these archives represent the definitive point of no return. The Crown protects its members only until the cost of that protection threatens the sanctity of the throne itself. In the cold light of these documents, the York's moral capital underwent a systemic liquidation. The sovereign interest demands that the infection be cauterized to save the integrity of the institution. History will record that the exile of Sarah Ferguson was not a media execution, but a self-inflicted erasure. Her own hand, preserved in the immutable ink of her letters, signed the warrant. The resulting silence is not an absence of sound, but the heavy weight of a final, irreversible judgment. The Carolean era has formalized the transition from a domestic dynasty to a streamlined state enterprise. Under King Charles III, The traditional sanctuary of the bloodline has been superseded by a clinical requirement for institutional safety. The monarchy is no longer a shield. It is a filter. In the quiet corridors of a medical facility in Alsace, the Duchess of York occupies a room within the staff quarters. The symbolism is precise. This is a physical descent from the sovereign estates of the United Kingdom to the functional dormitories of the service class. Palace officials now observe what is categorized as the blackmail of despair. With her commercial foundations erased, Ferguson is trapped in a terminal paradox. To survive financially, she must liquidate the only asset she has left, the silence she owes the crown. The sovereign has not merely withdrawn support. He has engineered an environment where every choice leads to the same periphery. In the rigid architecture of the Windsor legacy, there is no middle ground between total loyalty and total erasure. History does not require her cooperation. The institution simply waits for the inevitable. The ledger is closed. The House of York is repeating a historical cycle first engineered in 1936. They have transitioned into the role of elite nomads, mirroring the post-abdication drift of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor through high society charity and precarious patronage. The world beyond the gates of the sovereign estate is strictly transactional. When the crown retracts its grace, proximity to power becomes a depreciating asset. In the 1990s, media engagement served to liquidate personal debt. The nature of the transgression has mutated from personal insolvency to systemic risk. A modern expose is no longer a bid for psychological autonomy. It is a weapon of institutional destabilization. The 1995 Panorama precedent established that royal protocol could be breached for survival. However, the Carolian era operates under a different set of clinical requirements. The king's streamlined enterprise cannot tolerate the pursuit of private relevance at the expense of dynastic sanctity. To monetize the internal mechanics of the crown is to ensure that the debt remains permanent. Exile is not merely a change of address. It is a total withdrawal of the institutional shield. In the ledger of the House of Windsor, silence is the only debt that can never be fully settled. The transaction is final. The transparency is absolute. The Carolean era has redefined the perimeter of royal protection. This is the moment the mystical veil was replaced by a clinical corporate contract. The detention of a prince of the blood serves as the final proof. The crown no longer shields the individual. It preserves the office. This surgical removal marks a definitive shift for those within the inner circle. It creates a new class of royal, the internal exile. These figures possess the intimate memories of the throne, but no longer share its interests. They are the living ghosts of the Windsor legacy, holding secrets that serve as their only leverage against total erasure. The Duchess of York remains the pioneer of this survivalist model. By turning the monarchy's internal mechanics into a market commodity, she has broken the ancient seal of silence. In doing so, she has ensured her permanent place in the footnotes, rather than the history books. The House of Windsor survives through its cold ability to adapt. It sacrifices its own to maintain the sanctity of the institution. This is not a tragedy of family, but a triumph of the state. The ledger of the House of York is closed, leaving only the clinical silence of the archives. If you value this deep examination of the crown's evolving architecture, subscribe to join our future investigations into the mechanics of power. Your contribution to this historical dialogue is invited in the comments below.